Economists, and I'm joined by the Shadow Environment Secretary, Jim McMahon. Good morning, Mr. McMahon.
Morning.
Is Labour going to support the government's plans on how to deal with this latest wave of Omicron, including the pre-travel tests and so forth?
Well, of course, it was the Labour Party who were calling for pre-testing to take place because we're very concerned that the government consistently throughout the pandemic have been very late in making the calls that are required to keep our borders safe, very late in terms of trying to spread control the spread of that virus. And what we want to do is to make sure that we don't jeopardise the vaccination rollout. The worst thing in the world, after all the sacrifices that we've made, is that a new variant comes in and completely takes the rug from under that programme. And so it's very important the government get a grip. It's very important the government take swift action. And frankly, it shouldn't be for the opposition to keep continually one step ahead of the government. The government needs to take control themselves.
Yeah, but getting a grip... would that involve, or should that have involved, bringing in plans to work from home or social distancing, or indeed a ban on Christmas parties? Whether or not you're ahead of the government, is that what you wanted?
We've been very clear that common sense measures that taken together keep us safer is the way to go. And so, of course, if a workplace is unsafe, then action will need to be taken. But many workplaces can be safe, providing that appropriate action is taken to maintain social distancing, to make sure that people are supported to self-isolate and to take sick leave if they need to, and that includes decent sick pay to allow people to do that. We've been very clear that common sense interventions are far better than a blunt instrument in this. And we want to make sure that after the sacrifice that we've made, and listen, most of us last year at Christmas were adhering to the rules, and we made sacrifices. We didn't see our loved ones, we didn't mix, we didn't have parties in the office, we adhered to the rules. After all that sacrifice that we've made, we want to look forward to this Christmas. And the only way to do that is for the government to have a very clear plan, for them to kind of get on with the booster vaccination rollout, and to make sure that throughout the course of that the messaging is really clear. Because the worst thing in the world is that the government say one thing but then do another. And people look at the actions of the government and they get a confused message.
I'm not entirely clear about your own message here. Would a clear plan involve saying to people you should not have Christmas parties, for example?
Well, we've been very clear it's for the government to bring forward the plan based on the scientific evidence and advice, and it's got to be a coherent plan. We've been very clear that we do not believe that Christmas parties should be cancelled. We believe that hospitality has been through a very difficult period, and it's very important for hospitality that we continue in the way that we want to. But that can only happen if we're not undermined by new strain variants coming into the country that completely take apart the vaccination rollout.
So what about vaccine passport for big events? Would you have insisted on that?
We've always wanted to take a common sense and evidence-based approach. And of course, it wasn't that long ago that we were saying very clearly that for large gatherings, that testing should be taking place to make sure that if people were carrying COVID, they weren't able then to spread it across a large group of people. But we've also been very clear that it's got to be a balanced approach. And so, you wouldn't necessarily need it for the pub or for the restaurants. We don't want to have unnecessary rules in place that really undermine confidence in hospitality, confidence in going out over Christmas. But equally, we do want people to be cautious. We are not on the other side of this yet. There's still many cases that are being identified. There's still many people who are in hospital through COVID, and we don't know yet the extent of the new variant. So, cautious, common sense approach is what's needed.
Well, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but what you've told me is you will back the steps that the government's taken. You would not do more than they have said that they want to do on Christmas parties. You would not introduce vaccine passports. You're basically telling me exactly the same as a government minister would tell me, which is to say, let's be cautious, let's be commonsensical, and so on. What's your problem with what the government's done then?
Well, first of all, it was Labour that called for the pre-departure testing to take place, and the government were late in coming to that conclusion themselves. It's the Labour Party who's calling for 500,000 booster vaccinations to be administered every day, and at the moment the government's only reaching 370,000. And so we are very clear about what's needed. We need to make sure that people are resilient and have the booster vaccination, but the government needs to do far more to make it accessible. They need to be investing in pop-up facilities, whether that's in campuses, on the high street, in work workplaces to make sure that it is accessible and people take that booster vaccination. By doing that, of course, they're more resilient to the virus. But equally, the vaccination program as it stands could easily be undermined by a new variant that completely undermines it. And so that's why it's really important that we have strong borders, but in doing so, make sure that we understand the implications of that for aviation, for tourism. Of course, we will begin to see consumer confidence diminish. It's very important the government have a single plan to make sure that common sense interventions on one hand fully see through the implications of that to make sure that our economy and our society is supported.
We've been in the north this week, Mr. McMahon, and you, of course, you're an Oldham MP. You'll have seen the impact of Storm Arwen. Do you think that what's been done is adequate? And frankly, do you think, as some people have said to me in the northeast, if that storm had hit the southeast, do you think that the response would have been the same as it has been?
Well, I'm in Oldham today, but I was further north earlier in the week when I went to County Durham to meet residents who are directly affected by the power outage. And that was now 6 days into the storm when I visited. One of the first things I did in my new role in the Shadow Cabinet. And when you hear the real lived experience of people, it beggars belief that in a national emergency, it wasn't considered a national priority. Where was Boris Johnson? Why wasn't Cobra called to deal with this? Why has it taken a week for the army to be called in? And I firmly believe, had this have been the case where 20,000 properties were without power in Surrey or in London, the government would absolutely have treated it with more seriousness. And I think for people in County Durham who I spoke to, they felt isolated, they felt angry, and they felt forgotten.
Michael Gove, who is the Levelling Up Secretary, has been talking this week, we understand, about introducing greater devolution to different parts of England, including, for example, the idea of what I think he calls governors, which are sort of like state governors in the United States. You were a local authority leader. Would you favour that sort of devolution?
I do think we have a very fragmented system of devolution in England in a way that is confused. It's not as clear as Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And the truth is the creation of the Metro Mayors has given sub-regions a voice, but the counties are voiceless. And actually, if you look at the way the government are directing money, aside from the red wall seats that they want to support, quite a lot of that is being sent through mayoral combined authorities at the disadvantage of many of our counties. And so the government do need a single plan to make sure that governance, accountability and investment in England is where it needs to be. Whether governors are the right approach, I'm not sure. I think, Keir Starmer has been really clear that when we talk about the power imbalance in this country, it's because people in the communities where they live don't believe they've got power over the direction of the places where they live. And so before we start talking about new politicians being created, we ought to talk about whether people feel able to drive the direction of the places where they live, in the communities where they live. And I think for many people, they don't feel that way, particularly, by the way, because the government continually take power away from local people. I mean, just look at one of the biggest things that actually affects your area is physical development, building work, construction. Well, actually, the government have taken that power away from many communities in favour of developers who quite often are not working in the interest of the local community. And so if we're talking about where power sits, it should be absolutely rooted in the communities where people live.
OK, well, let's talk about power. Let's talk about how you get your hands on some. You came second in a by-election in Bexley this week, which is encouraging. You had a 10% swing from the Conservatives, which is pretty good. But according to John Curtis, who is the great authority on these things, even a 10% swing repeated all over the country still wouldn't give you a majority. There is a massive mountain to climb for Labour, isn't there?
So we understand fully the challenge ahead of us, but also we reflect on the progress that we have made. In 2019, the election was a disaster. People weren't willing to even consider Labour being in government, but now Keir Starmer, as our leader, has earned us the right to be heard. But now what we need to do is to convince people that we've got a plan, an alternative plan for this country. And that's very much the kind of framing of the new shadow cabinet. That's very much the framing that Keir Starmer is keen to get out there. And I think actually now that restrictions have eased and we're able to get around the country more, we are able to speak to people in the places where they live in a direct way that I do believe is cutting through. And actually, you know, the Bexley by-election for the Tories was a disaster. Not least of all, it would have put, you know, if that was seen through in a general election, it would have put Labour very close to majority government. But the truth is that every day that passes, the Conservatives are getting worse. They are being found out. People see them for what they are, which is it's one rule for them and it's another for everybody else. And people are fed up with having that liberty.
At your first shadow cabinet meeting, did you actually talk about the issue of your pathway back to power, which for most observers only lies through two pathways? One, that Nigel Farage takes enough votes off the Tories to lose them many of the constituencies that they now hold, or that you do a deal with Nicola Sturgeon. Did you discuss at the Shadow Cabinet how it feels to be beholden either to Nigel Farage or Nicola Sturgeon, or both, to get into number 10?
Well, not really, because the conversations that we have at Shadow Cabinet are not defeatist conversations. They are positive conversations. They're ambitious conversations, and we are ambitious not for ourselves,
I'm talking about being realistic.
For the people who live here. And so we're absolutely clear that with our path to government, with a plan that's being set out, that by the time we get to the general election, that we will be in a position to form a majority government. That's the project. That's exactly what we're in politics to do.
Jim McMahon, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.